Villarbonneau, France. Early in the morning of October 31st, 2008, a local resident who had gone out for his usual walk with the dog noticed something unexpected in a field near the railway tracks. A burnt-out car with very little left of it. The windows were gone, the tires had melted, the plastic parts and the upholstery had been completely destroyed by fire. The man hurried to contact the police, who unfortunately discovered victims inside the vehicle. On the back seat lay a human body, or rather, what was left of it. The arms and legs were missing, and the skull was deformed. At that stage, the forensic expert could only say that it had been a man. Another body was found in the trunk. It was a dog. Sadly, it had shared the fate of the man, probably its owner. Though, of course, the officers couldn't be sure of that yet. One thing, however, was beyond doubt. Before the vehicle was set on fire, it had been doused with some flammable liquid. At first, investigators weren't sure whether it was a case of murder or if the man himself had chosen such an end, taking his pet with him into death. But what puzzled them in the suicide theory was the fact that the man had been seated in the rear passenger seat. That was an unnatural position for someone alone in their own car. Very quickly, the investigators began leaning toward the criminal hypothesis. Inside the car, they found no ignition key, no wallet, no phone, only the two bodies. But fortunately for the investigation, the fire had spared the license plate. It was lying nearby, and some of its numbers were still legible. This meant they could search the vehicle database and identify the owner. Since Villarbonneau is a very small French village, locating the car's owner turned out to be rather easy. It was Daniel Cano, who lived just 150 meters from where the car had been found. The investigators headed straight to his address. A beautiful woman opened the door. She introduced herself as Madame Cano, Manuela Cano. The police officers were in no hurry to shock her with the news of the terrible discovery. First, they carefully asked where her husband was. What struck them unpleasantly was that Manuela answered their questions calmly, without making the slightest attempt to ask any in return. The police were used to people immediately wanting to know what had happened and why the police had come. Manuela's relaxed demeanor almost unsettled them. In any case, after hearing that Daniel was not at home, the police asked his wife for permission to search the house. There, they discovered the man's phone, driver's license, and identity card. In the garage, they also noticed a dog basket. Manuela explained that it belonged to her daughter's dog. At this point, the officers were almost certain that the body found in the burnout car was that of Daniel Cano, which meant they now had to ask his wife when she had last seen him. Manuela said that on the morning of the previous day, October 30, her husband had been chopping wood. He developed a headache and took some medicine. Apparently, he had made a mistake. Instead of taking a painkiller, he had taken a sleeping pill. The investigators silently noted that such a mistake was not unthinkable. The Cano household was full of medications, on the kitchen shelves, in the bathroom, in the bedroom. This happens sometimes, but it is rare to find a home that resembles a small pharmacy. In any case, Manuela went on, she said that after lunch, the couple had decided to visit her parents, who lived 80 kilometers away from Villarbonneau. Manuela took the wheel, letting her husband nap. However, he fell asleep so deeply that when they arrived, she left him in the car and went inside to see her family alone. Around 8 or 9 in the evening, the couple returned home and got into an argument. Daniel left the house. Manuela, meanwhile, took a sleeping pill and went to bed, not caring whether he came back or not. When she woke up the next morning and did not see him, she assumed he had gone to work. That was all she could say about her husband's last day. Within a few days, the pathologist confirmed that the charred body was indeed Daniel Cano's. Daniel, 58, worked as a welder and was generally a skilled handyman. Manuela, for her part, was engaged in her passion, running her own driving school. The couple had met in 1991 when Daniel was 40 and Manuela was 30. Both had children from previous relationships. Daniel had a son, Nicholas, and Manuela a daughter, Virginie. The children were about the same age and quickly became close friends. Manuela became a second mother to Nicholas, guiding him with his studies and household responsibilities. Daniel, in turn, treated his stepdaughter with great kindness. In many ways, theirs was an exemplary family. They lived in a house that Daniel had built with his own hands. They had been together for 17 years. Even though the children were grown, they continued to see each other often, gathering for dinner at the family home. In December 2008, the toxicology report came in. According to it, at the time of his death, Daniel's body contained 3 medications, 2 different sleeping pills, and 1 neuroleptic drug. This combination can cause not only drowsiness, but can also plunge a person into a state resembling a coma. In other words, when the killer set fire to the car with Daniel and the dog inside, the man was most likely unconscious. However, Daniel had been taking only one medication, medicine for hypertension. Nothing else had ever been prescribed to him, unlike his wife. Among the prescriptions issued to Manuela, the officers found the names of all 3 drugs that were detected in her late husband's body. This discovery prompted the police to take a much closer look at the victim's wife. They felt she was hiding something from them. Their suspicions only grew stronger when they learned that a month earlier, Daniel had already come within a hair's breadth of death and had survived by sheer luck. During their search of the Cano family home, the officers had already noticed that one of the rooms, the couple's bedroom, looked strikingly different from the others. It had clearly been damaged by fire not long ago. Indeed, on September 29, 2008, a fire had broken out in the Cano household. It was Manuela who called the firefighters, and while they extinguished the flames, she simply sat on the couch, waiting for them to finish and leave. Meanwhile, the firefighters noticed her husband, Daniel, lying on the sofa with severe burns. His wife explained that he had been in the bedroom when the fire started. He woke up, she led him downstairs, and despite the burns, he fell asleep again. The firefighters gave him first aid and transported him to the hospital. Manuela explained that a month earlier, Daniel's mother had died, and in her memory, he had lit a candle. But the dog had run into the bedroom, knocked over the candle, and caused the fire. The story sounded plausible, so no investigation into the fire was launched. Still, the doctors found it strange that Daniel had slept so deeply and, when finally roused, could barely string 2 words together. At the hospital, tests revealed that he had taken sleeping pills. But again, Manuela was quick to explain. Her husband had been grieving his mother's death and had recently been using her sleeping medication. This explanation was accepted, and no further questions were asked. However, sometime later, when Nicholas came for dinner with his father and the stepmother, he overheard his father say, "Listen, don't take me for a fool. I know for sure there were no candles in that room." In other words, Daniel knew the dog couldn't have knocked over a candle. So why didn't he pursue the matter or go to the police with his suspicions? It's hard to say. Perhaps he still loved his wife. Or maybe he simply didn't want to cause her any trouble, and it was easier for him to think about divorce, but he never got the chance. The circle of the investigation was tightening around Manuela, yet the police could not understand why she would want to kill her husband. They had lived together for 17 years, and everything suggested that they got along well. They seemed to be a close, solid family, but in reality, things were not as perfect as they appeared. Manuela had a dangerous addiction, not to illegal substances, but to casinos and gambling. She was a compulsive gambler, a slave to slot machines. Her gambling debts amounted to around 90,000 euros. In order to deal with her debts, and most likely to continue going to the casino, she resorted to fraud. As the director of a driving school, she set up a scheme that made it easier for candidates to obtain driver's licenses, provided they paid her 1,500 euros. To achieve this, Manuela seduced a licensing inspector. However, her secret eventually came to light, and in 2004, 4 years before Daniel's death, an investigation was launched. Manuela was fined 80,000 euros. She was forced to sell the driving school to her brother. In other words, 4 years earlier, Daniel had already seen a completely different side of his wife, and the discovery deeply shocked him. But even then, he didn't know everything. The situation reached its peak on March 28, 2008, when Daniel received a call from a bank employee informing him that he and his wife were behind on their monthly loan payment, and if the money was not received, the bank would be forced to seize the family home. That day, Daniel unexpectedly learned that he had mortgaged the house and received 165,000 euros. It turned out that he and his wife had both signed the loan documents, though he had no idea about it. Daniel loved that house, had built it with his own hands, and would never have mortgaged it. In fact, he didn't know about the loan because he had never signed the papers at the notary. Someone else had impersonated him and signed the documents. The investigation would never be able to determine who went to the notary with Manuela that day. In any case, it was a shock for Daniel, which led to serious disagreements with his wife. He no longer trusted her and became increasingly convinced that he should get a divorce. It should be noted that Daniel normally would not have discovered the loan because Manuela herself regularly made the monthly payments. But in 2008, she had fallen down the stairs, was hospitalized, and missed a payment, prompting the bank to contact her husband. In addition, when the investigators reviewed the couple's bank accounts, they saw that about a month and a half before Daniel's death, someone had withdrawn money from his accounts and transferred it to the couple's joint account, after which the funds ended up in Manuela's personal accounts. Considering that Daniel died soon afterward, This appeared highly suspicious. In addition, the police discovered that both Daniel and the house he had built were insured. This meant that in the event of his death, the house would remain in the family, and his wife would inherit 3/4 of it. Combined with a life insurance policy worth 234,000 euros, this amounted to a substantial sum that Manuela would receive after her husband's death. Thus, the investigation focused on a single suspect. However, the police had no direct evidence linking her to the murder. If the detectives hoped to obtain a confession from Manuela, they needed to learn as much as possible about her life and past. As they delved into her history, one surprise after another awaited them. Life had not been kind to Manuela. 3 of her lovers had died, and according to the official version, the cause was sheer, incredible misfortune. Manuela Gonzalez was born on October 14, 1960, into a family of Spanish descent in the town of Lemure, south of Grenoble. It was a mining town, and her father worked as a miner. Manuela had 7 siblings, and they were a very close-knit family. She was a cheerful, pleasant, and very beautiful girl. While still in high school, in 1978, she married Gilbert Martoya. The couple had a daughter, Virginie. However, her young husband soon began experiencing health problems. In 1983, he even spent 3 months in the hospital. He had ingested Temesta, lorazepam, and at the time, everyone assumed he had intentionally overdosed. But when the police investigating Daniel's murder spoke with him, he explained that he had suffered from stomach issues, had undergone surgery, and had been gradually recovering. He had no reason to take such a large quantity of the medication, nor did he intend to end his life. This raised the natural question of how the drug had entered his system. However, it was clear that Gilbert did not want to fully disclose all the facts, perhaps trying to protect his ex-wife or not wanting it to affect their daughter. In any case, after parting ways with her first husband, Manuela did not remain alone for long. The young divorced woman was left with a child in her care and struggled to make ends meet, maintaining several paid relationships. One of her clients was a jeweler, Michel Garcia. However, in October 1984, the man suddenly fell into a coma and was admitted to the emergency room after drinking tea prepared by Manuela. This happened because she had generously spiked it with the same lorazepam. While the man was in a coma, Manuela stole a check worth 80,000 francs from him. However, the man recovered and realized he had been robbed. He did not hesitate to go to the police. Manuela changed her statements several times but eventually admitted to stealing the check. She claimed that she had only given Michel a sleeping pill. However, laboratory analysis revealed the same powerful drug, lorazepam. Manuela admitted that she had financial problems and that this was the only solution she found to get the money. The court sentenced her to 2 years of suspended imprisonment. At this point, one might have expected the young woman to reconsider her life choices. But Manuela had other plans. She entered into a new relationship with Francois Colasso, the owner of a bar in a small town near Villarbonneau. Francois was a simple, hard-working, and friendly man who treated his girlfriend well, but his fate would not spare him. On April 29, 1989, Manuela found him in the garage of their home. The man had died from inhaling car exhaust. The autopsy revealed that he had ingested lorazepam beforehand. After several months of investigation, the police concluded that the man had chosen to inhale the exhaust gases himself. The case was closed, despite protests from his family, who did not believe the version of his voluntary death. Very soon after Francois' death, Manuela began seeing Thierry Lechevalier. On April 6, 1991, neighbors noticed smoke coming from his house. They called the firefighters, who went upstairs and found the source of the smoke. It was coming from a closet. Inside the closet lay Thierry, completely covered in smoldering newspapers. The man was dead. Once again, the toxicology report revealed that he had taken lorazepam. The police launched an investigation because the circumstances of his death were more than suspicious. But Manuela claimed that Thierry had undoubtedly chosen this way to say goodbye to life himself. Yet who would lock themselves in a closet and set newspapers on fire? Moreover, it was very strange that on the day of his death, the man had taken out a loan of 4,000 euros and handed the money to his girlfriend, Manuela, to help her fulfill her dream of opening a driving school. Convinced that Thierry had been murdered, the detectives arrested Manuela. However, she was soon released, thanks to the testimony of a witness who claimed that she could not have killed Thierry because she had been with him. The witness was her lover, Daniel Cano. The investigation continued for another couple of years, but ultimately the case was closed. Thus, nearly all the men who decided to share their lives with Manuela met a very grim fate. In the best-case scenario, they suffered serious poisoning and hospitalization. In the worst-case scenario, it was terrifying even to imagine. Manuela always claimed that she was simply unlucky. Considering that several of her lovers had died, there were 2 fires, a strange attachment of all her men to lorazepam, and large sums of cash that Manuela invariably received. The investigators did not believe her, yet they were in no hurry to arrest her. Instead, they began to wiretap her phone and the phones of all her family members. They discovered that on October 31st at 8:05 a.m., Manuela's sister Francesca called their parents to report Daniel's death. But here's the catch. At that time, the police had only discovered the burned-out car. They had not yet determined who it belonged to, nor had they had a chance to speak with Manuela. So how did his wife already know that she had become a widow? This is where she slipped up over such a small detail. A loving daughter had called her family far too quickly. While the police were gathering information, a year and a half passed. Finally, on March 23, 2010, investigators decided to interrogate Manuela. She did not even consider confessing to anything. But despite her protests of innocence, she was charged with attempted murder and the murder of her husband. The police could not bring charges related to the cases of her other victims, whom they believed she had killed, because those cases had been closed or discontinued and could not be reopened. The trial took place in April 2014 at the Palais de Justice in Grenoble. Fortunately for the prosecution, and unfortunately for Manuela's defense, the prosecutor was allowed to list all the other crimes she was suspected of. Otherwise, with almost no evidence, proving her guilt would have been difficult. But her past painted a very different picture, and the defendant was found guilty. The prosecutor demanded a 25-year prison sentence for Manuela Cano, but she was sentenced to 30 years. Of course, she immediately filed an appeal. Her lawyers petitioned for her release while awaiting the second trial, and their request was granted. On September 21, 2015, Manuela was released. The new trial began on May 23, 2016, and it did not come without surprises. Manuela appeared accompanied by her family. She had dyed her hair blonde. As the media venomously noted, she probably wanted to soften associations with the Black Widow nickname she had been given. She and her lawyer took a desperate step. They requested the exhumation of Daniel's mother, claiming that he had left a note in her coffin, stating that he would soon join her, hinting that he intended to follow his mother in death. The court refused the exhumation order. Firstly, after so many years, the note, if it existed, would likely have deteriorated and its words would be unreadable. Secondly, even if he had written something like, "See you in heaven," it would have had no legal bearing. The court again sentenced Manuela to 30 years in prison. She filed appeals to the Court of Cassation and the European Court of Human Rights, both of which were unsuccessful. She still maintains her innocence regarding the death of her husband and the death of each of her husbands and lovers.